For centuries, the question of what happens after we die belonged to philosophers and priests. But what if science is starting to get in on the action? In this explainer, we're diving into a really fascinating argument that claims the clues to this whole mystery are hiding in plain sight, in both modern medical data and in ancient spiritual texts. It really is the ultimate question, isn't it? What happens when it's all over? We kind of just assume that the people who find out the answer, well, they can't exactly come back and tell us about it. But what if some of them do? Okay, so let's start with what we can actually observe. We're going right to the front lines, into the world of modern medicine, where that solid line between life and death has gotten surprisingly blurry. So, what does it actually mean to be dead in today's world? Well, medically, it seems pretty clear-cut. Your heart stops beating for good, and your brain function has completely and irreversibly shut down. That's it. Game over. Sounds pretty final, right? Well, here's where that one little word, irreversible, starts to get really tricky because some people who tick both of those boxes, they come back. I mean, think about someone being brought back with CPR after their heart has stopped. The source we're exploring says this isn't just some rare, one-off miracle. It's a documented medical reality that makes you question how final the end really is. And listen, we're not talking about a handful of strange cases here. The source points to data that suggests something like 9 million people in the US alone have reported having a near-death experience. All of a sudden, we have this massive amount of data, these firsthand accounts from people who have, for all intents and purposes, crossed that threshold. And that's pushing science to ask some pretty big questions. So, what on earth can we learn from these millions of incredible reports? Well, they actually form the basis for a really compelling scientific argument about consciousness itself. Is it just something our brain cooks up? Or could it be something else entirely? What's absolutely wild is how similar these stories are. It doesn't matter what your background is or what you believe, people report the same things. Seeing their entire life flash before their eyes, floating above their own body, and, maybe the most amazing part, accurately hearing and remembering conversations that happened in the room while they were clinically dead. Now, the source we're examining really zeroes in on a 2013 study by a Dr. Sam Parnia as a critical piece of the puzzle. And it's important to note the source interprets his work as a groundbreaking discovery, arguing that it's proof positive that our consciousness can and does exist even after the body has technically died. So this all leads to a pretty radical idea that you and I aren't just one thing. We're two. There's the physical, mortal body that, eventually wears out, and then there's this non-physical consciousness that can actually outlive the body. And in these near-death cases, it can even leave and then come back. And this is where our source takes a really fascinating turn. It suggests that this very modern, scientific-sounding idea of a separate surviving consciousness was actually described in incredible detail thousands of years ago in the ancient Indian scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. So here's how the source connects the dots. This quote from the Gita basically says, look, just as your consciousness, your self, stays the same while your body changes from a kid to a teenager to an old person, that very same consciousness just moves into a new body when the old one dies. It's the same process, just on a bigger scale. The Gita even has a specific word for this quality of consciousness, avinashi. It literally means indestructible. The concept here is almost like a law of physics. You know how energy can't be created or destroyed, it just changes form? Well, the Gita says consciousness is just like that. It just changes its container. Okay, so that brings up a pretty big question, right? If our consciousness just moves into a new body, what decides what kind of body we get next? Is it random? Well, according to this source, the Bhagavad Gita lays out a very specific set of rules for how it all works. And here it is, the absolute core of the whole mechanism. The source points to the Gita's 8th chapter, which claims that whatever your mind is fixated on at that single, precise moment of death, that is the single biggest factor that determines your entire next existence. And the source gives some really wild, vivid examples of how this could play out. Say your final thought is filled with love for your pet dog. Your next life could be as a dog. If you die with this intense, unsatisfied craving for meat, maybe you come back as a tiger. If you're dreaming of the feeling of being in the water, you might just become a fish. Your very last thought literally becomes the blueprint for your next reality. So if we're all caught in this continuous cycle of birth and death, moving from one body to the next, Is there a way to get off the ride? The final part of our source lays out what it calls the ultimate path to liberation from this whole process. So, the path out, as described here, is a spiritual one. The source explains that if a person's consciousness is focused entirely on Krishna at that critical moment of death, it doesn't get rerouted into another physical body. Instead, it enters a totally different kind of existence, an eternal spiritual realm. And that's it. The cycle is broken for good. But, and this is a big but, there's a catch. The source is really clear that this isn't some last-minute hack. You can't just live your whole life one way and then decide to think of Krishna in your final breath. To be able to achieve that state of mind right at the end is seen as the final result of a whole lifetime of practice and focus. So how do you actually practice this? The source offers a very specific method: the regular chanting of the Hare Krishna mantra. This is presented as the main tool, the simplest and most powerful way to cultivate that Krishna consciousness and prepare yourself for that final, all-important moment. So when you step back and look at it, this whole argument takes us on an incredible journey, from a modern operating room to the pages of an ancient text, from clinical data on near-death experiences to a spiritual path of liberation. And it leaves us wrestling with a really fundamental question. In this search for what lies beyond, where does the evidence of science stop, and where does the journey of faith have to begin?